Well, we want to shift
see.
gears to another very important issue, one that we've talked about quite a bit. I know from our perspective, Rania, sometimes it feels like we've talked this thing to death, but it's obviously super crucial. That's Ukraine. And we've got a special treat for you listeners. We have the editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, Ben Becker, with us for the first time on the Freedom Side.
His debut.
Ben, welcome.
It's historic. Thank you for having me. You know, I don't know how I got the invite, but it's amazing to finally, it's like a dream come true.
Well, there was a long list of people, and ultimately you made it to the top. You know, it was, so just keep that in mind as you answer your questions.
Wow.
No, and I honestly, I didn't introduce you correctly. Dr. Ben Becker, by the way, very august, astute individual. Very happy to have you with us. You know, Ukraine, you know, it's almost like where to start on Ukraine. There's so much going on. But I guess maybe my first question for you, Ben, is, you know, I think the perception in the Western media is either like, A, Ukraine is winning and like on the way to total victory, or Ukraine is like just on the cusp of total victory. So we just have to keep sending them more weapons and more money, and it's all gonna work out and they're gonna win. And I guess my question to you is not necessarily, I mean, I'm curious what you think about that narrative, but also like, what are the implications of that narrative vis-a-vis this policy of just continuing to dump arms into Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what does a total victory even mean in the situation? I mean, I think that's the core question. I don't think it's true, almost no matter how you define it, that Ukraine is in a total victory. I mean, the way that Zelensky and others have been speaking in, you know, for the last 100 days, we're almost at 100 days of the war. You know, the war has been grinding on tens of thousands of casualties now on both sides. It's like really intense, ferocious fighting. The fact that even that we're getting, I think, fewer social media images than we were at the beginning, that can only mean that things have gotten in a very dark place in terms of the type of. There's a lot of, you know, misinformation, which is very normal in a war. For real, both sides will always claim that they are being victorious on the battlefield, because morale is an indispensable element of military tactics and strategy. You know, there's not like a lot of independent reporting going on for the outside world. And there's not a lot of independent reporters. So it's definitely clear, though, that Russia has been making some battlefield gains in eastern Ukraine in particular, since they've decided to focus on that region. You know, Ukraine claims that they're making some advances in southern Ukraine. But I think just looking at the tenor and language of some U.S. representatives, those who were using a lot of triumphant language a few weeks ago about, like, Nancy Pelosi, who said we're going to fight till victory, again, whatever that means. And I think we should discuss that at some length, because I think that's really the core question. And other people were saying, you know, Joe Biden said basically we're going to take out Vladimir Putin, that we want him gone. Lloyd Austin said we're going to permanently weaken Russia. So a few weeks ago, when it felt like, you know, I think that Ukraine was clearly doing better than a lot of countries expecting. The infusion of U.S. and Western weapons was helping quite a bit. Parts of Ukraine that some thought would fall, including I think the Russian government thought would fall more easily, did not. So there was a lot of this triumphant mood, like we're going to win total victory. So I guess total victory for them really meant like regime change. Some defined it as a full expulsion of Russia from all parts of eastern Ukraine, even in places where they're firmly entrenched. Some said they're going to retake Crimea. But, you know, these are, you know, this is a pipe dream, some of these things. I think that's not even on the table. And to actually fight for these things, to actually put them out and define them as victory, saying this is what a win would look like, basically means you're putting the region and really the world on a very long path to a war that can only escalate. And I think that is the real danger of the current moment. Despite all these kind of murmurs about negotiations and ceasefire and all these other things, I think the real danger is of a even greater escalation to what we've already seen and what has already been a very grueling, devastating war.
And when we do talk about victory from the Western side, obviously there's a lot of delusional thinking about what a victory could mean or would mean. And we can talk more about that. But I think there's an interesting aspect of this war, and that is, the economic war against Russia. This maximum pressure campaign against Russia that was supposed to crash the economy in Russia. But as we've seen, the economy in Russia hasn't crashed. In fact, the ruble is stronger now than it was before the war. And there's a lot of questions about why that is, though Western media, Western pundits are starting to admit that actually Russia has been more resilient than they expected, has been able to withstand this. So I guess, the goalposts for Russia are easy to shift because in the beginning of this war, they had very vague ideas of what victory would mean for them. But from the Russian perspective, what does a victory look like?
Well, I mean, even that has shifted a little bit. I mean, I think if you go back to the original red lines, which were bright red lines that the Russian government has been putting up for years now about Ukraine not becoming a member of NATO, for instance. They also said they wanted to block advanced weapon systems from being placed on the Russian border, that these were core national interests, things they had raised going back, for 15 years now, that NATO expansion to the former Soviet republics, especially in that area, in Ukraine, a region, Ukraine and Belarus, Russia was invaded through those territories in 2 world wars, that these were non-negotiables for them. So they've said at some point that just sort of preventing Ukraine from coming into NATO was the core issue. Obviously, this was a big, major, the impetus for the 2014 coup was about whether Ukraine would have a pro-Western or pro-Russian orientation. Russia said that Ukraine should essentially be neutral, or at least not join EU and NATO. On the other hand, when the war started, Putin said it was to demilitarize and denazify the country. And so those were established as the strategic goals. And then a little bit later, after the full-scale bombing or the large, more wider bombing of Ukraine, now there's a focus on the protection of the East. So even on the Russian side, the strategic goals have shifted somewhat. But I do think the question of Ukraine sort of becoming a permanent outpost of Western militarism, which is, really was the bottom line issue for Russia for so many years. Now, Ukraine is getting those large scale weapon systems. Now, they're saying they're not going to use these missiles to strike Russia. Biden said they promised us they wouldn't strike, Russia with these missile systems. And NATO is obviously trying to expand now into Norway, into Sweden. So that's increasing the military encirclement of Russia on that side. So I don't think that any side really is in a position to claim some great strategic victory at this point. Although I do think the U.S. is ultimately quite happy with the war. And I think in a way, the reason why they are so content to see it continue and to pump more weapons in is because they do have this fantasy that if they can just bleed Russia like they did with the Afghanistan war in the 1980s, they can permanently damage Russia. And look, they've already used this war to consolidate Europe behind U.S. hegemony, and they feel that they can just do the same thing they did before and basically bully the world into submission. Again, I think that is a total fantasy. As you've been saying, Rania, many other countries in the world have, if not come to Russia's defense, have decided to completely stay neutral and to maintain their economic ties. And I think those countries are making a fairly valid point, a very valid point, to be honest. Even if they didn't like the U.S. War in Iraq, there was no big international campaign. No country cut relations with the United States that I remember over the genocidal war in Iraq. And they continued their economic relationships. And they said, look, even whether we have our opinion or not, we have interests to maintain our economic status quo with the United States. And I think a lot of countries are saying we're not going to just give up all of our economic relationships, which are quite extensive with Russia, just because the Pentagon tells us to.
I think that's a really good point. And it does sort of remind me of also, victory is defined on whose terms, right? Like Biden in his New York Times op-ed, and Nancy Pelosi and others you mentioned, they're always kind of talking about like our victory. And Biden in the op-ed, is saying that this is critically important for America. And he goes on to say that the reason why it's critically important for America is, well, we can't stop Russia. If we don't stop Russia here, that it shows that the principle of might makes right, prevails, and that countries will just start invading other countries. What do you think about that, Ben?
I mean, look where we are. I mean, like, are you kidding me? I mean, the death count. Kay Pritzker here made a video of just interventions in Latin America, and it filled up with 8-point font, and it filled up the whole screen the other day. I mean, if we want to do all U.S. invasions, we could have hours and hours of shows. The idea, I mean, the shamelessness of comments like that, it's hard to wrap your head around. And then this idea that we're going to have victory over Russia, a nuclear power. What does that mean? You couldn't defeat the Taliban. You couldn't defeat the Iraqi resistance. What makes you think you're going to, I mean, and that took 20 years. And what makes you think you're going to have a quick victory over Russia, whatever that means? So this idea now has set in, and it's based on the arrogance and the hubris, which suffuses the foreign policy establishment and Congress, which of course never goes to die either. We shouldn't, a lot of this is that, like, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, all this, like, we're going to fight to the finish. It's not like real, like, valor in battle exactly. You're sending weapons to make another country, a smaller country, fight interminably against a much larger country with no pathway to, quote, victory anyway. So it's really a form of insanity. But if you say that this is a form of an insanity, you're called basically an appeaser. You're like, you're appeasing Nazism. This is what the metaphor that's being used all throughout the U.S. media right now, at least in the mainstream media, is that if you even raise the idea that there should be a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic solution, that there's not a military solution to this crisis, that therefore you are essentially appeasing and rewarding Nazism, which is of course what they say every time they want a war to continue.
That's a really good point you make about who's actually like dying here and whose lives get sacrificed. And this is actually true in so many regions of the world. Like it reminds me of the US and the Middle East. One of the reasons Saudi Arabia is like sitting down and negotiating with Iran right now is because they're watching what's happened with Ukraine. And they realize that if the US brings the region to the precipice of war at this point, it's going to be them who have to fight and die in it. It's not going to be America. So I think that's a really, really excellent point. But to what you mentioned about appeasing Nazis, I think that's a good segue into the fact that, even if this war ends tomorrow, which it's not going to, I think it's going to go on for a very long time based on what you're saying. But there's going to be blowback here. I mean, $40 billion in weapons. Nobody knows who they're going to. They're just being dumped in Ukraine. And those weapons are going to make their way like around the region, around the world for decades to come. But also there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. I mean, that's not to say what Russia's saying is all correct and Ukraine is all a country of Nazis, but we know that there are groups in Ukraine like the Azov Battalion and others that are like pretty explicitly white supremacist Nazi groups that are getting weapons, that are getting, they're getting foreign fighters coming to fight with them. So what do you think is the risk of blowback from this? Because you do have an international far right that is becoming increasingly strong, especially like as we see this sort of decay in the neoliberal order. How do you see this playing out for the next decade? I mean, we can just sit here and speculate, but I think it's important to speculate.
Well, even the fact that they would use the Soviet Afghanistan war as their reference point of what, and this is what Hillary Clinton said, this is something kind of we're aiming for. I mean, that was the conflict that seeded so much of the fundamentalism and the blowback for the next 20, 30 years. So the fact that they're referencing that's like a success story for them. I mean, one can only, I think it's a very important thing to speculate about. Where do these weapons end up? We know for a fact that far-right forces are using this as a great opportunity to train and to militarize throughout Europe and throughout the world. And I think you're right that these weapons, there's no clarity about where they end up. Who knows how many will get smuggled where and how they'll be used. I mean, this is the catastrophe for humanity that many of us have been warning about for months now, and that you've been warning about, and all your guests have been warning about, why we need peace. Because where does this lead the world? I mean, we have major existential crises dealing with the climate. Now we have one of potential nuclear war, now that the U.S. is, again, fantasizing about this concept of winning a nuclear war, that if it comes to that the U.S. will come out on top. This is like official U.S. strategic policy now, having scrapped all the nuclear treaties that were in place for decades to maintain nuclear parity and make sure that something like that would not happen. They've now thrown that out the window. So we have climate catastrophe, nuclear war, pandemic, we have a crisis of jobs, and now a crisis of inflation. And, instead of meeting the scale of all those crises, they say, well, let's just pour more fuel on the fire, and let's hand over more weapons to who knows who, and let's hand over more money to the weapons contractors, all of which is actually gonna, war does not help the environment. War is making the inflationary crisis so much worse. It's actually a policy that it's so clearly not in the service of the interests of humanity, who would want a negotiated settlement to this. And yet this is precisely the problem we have in our country, where it's a tiny few people, less than 1%. The Occupy said 99 to 1%. That was the Occupy Wall Street slogan. Even that was very generous. We're talking about a minuscule percentage of people who are really benefiting from policies like this. And that's why they need to be displaced. I mean, it's actually become like a question of an existential crisis about the survival of the people on the planet, whether we let people like this basically decide all the policies that impact our lives.
No, I think it's a good point. It's the 0.01%. And even that might be a little bit generous. I mean, we talked about the Princeton study earlier, that showed how business groups have so much inordinate influence, really the most influence over anyone. The famous study from 2014 said we're not in a democracy. But it just really, I think it's one of the things, I'm on a tangent now, but I'm glad you said it, because I think it's one of those things that people underplay, which is really the extraordinarily limited impact we have, and how that warps this concept of patriotism, because we're essentially told these things are being done in our name. And I think, Ben, that's an important question, is I think for people in the United States, this feels like such a critically existential question about how or what you're going to say about this, because as you said, it's pouring fuel on the flames of all these different crises that are affecting all of humanity around the world at the level of true. I mean, these UN reports keep coming out. One came out last week talking about global collapse. Seems like one of the more likely scenarios over like the medium term period, which sounds scary to me. So anyway, I guess maybe just to speak to, what impact maybe this should be having on, the so-called electorate, the so-called public in America.
Well, the problem that we're facing in the United States, which is not the same problem that everyone is necessarily facing, because I think a lot of people around the world see through the U.S. propaganda on this war. They understand the deeper historical roots of this current conflict, and how the war was provoked by NATO expansion, and how this was clearly going to happen in the way that things were proceeding, and so therefore aren't really falling for the moralizing of the United States government. Maybe they've watched a lot of breakthrough news videos, for instance, and have that full historical context. But in any case, in the United States, it's like nonstop propaganda of the exact same type, and from almost all the corners of, liberal, conservative, and so forth. So the real challenge that people have is that many people actually believe that sending weapons to Ukraine is in the interest of peace. And they think that actually it's responding to a war, and it's trying to defend the little guy. And it's very narrow. It's very like, this is like, if you've only started following things when you see the picture of a devastated building or someone who's been killed, and you think, how can we help? It's this very kind of reactive policy. And so, I think that would really change if, for instance, the war were to escalate, and then the U.S. says, actually, we need to send your kids to go die in a war in Ukraine, and you have to go fight in Russia. Then I think you'd have a very big anti-war movement, and people would be like, wait, what is this war about? How can we end it without dying? How can we bring this thing? But right now it's kind of, it's enough not in people's day-to-day consciousness that they can just look at the headlines and the picture. So first of all, we have to understand, and we have to help people understand the deeper historical roots, so that they have an understanding of how to get to peace. Because right now we basically have this propaganda that more war is the road to peace. Escalation without a definitive goal is the road to peace. And we have to really challenge that. I do think that events like the People Summit, like your previous guest had spoken of, are extremely important, because it's these moments where we get to say, look, this is what the powers in Washington want for the world. This is their vision of quote unquote democracy. This is their vision of international cooperation. It doesn't work. It's hollow. It's based on arrogance and hubris and 400 years of colonialism. And this is our vision. And it's a vision based on respect for sovereignty, on peace, on justice, decent wages, respect for women's rights, and the rest. And we have to actually raise at this moment where it just seems like everything is so dark, and we can't just go into a doom and gloom perspective. You know, there's that saying that it's easier for people to now envision the end of the world than it is for them to envision a new world, envision a new system. It's actually harder to envision a system other than capitalism. They can easily envision global catastrophe and apocalypse because we have 100,000 movies that show us what that looks like. But what does it look like to live in a world, you know, that has completely different values? And without such a vision, I think that it becomes like self-fulfilling, that much darker prophecy. And that's the responsibility of activists and organizers in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think it's critically important, and I mean, you sort of alluded to this in a couple different ways, but you know, before we let you go, talk about the importance of independent media in the context of, you know, all of these different struggles and how it connects to, you know, the day-to-day sort of political movements, if you will.
Well, if you look at this Ukraine crisis, where I think we've gained a lot of new followers because people felt like no matter where they turned to, on TV, on YouTube, on Twitter, they were getting pretty much the same talking points, just packaged in a little bit different way. And so, you know, having independent media that can actually go through the historical record and help bring out perspectives that you're never going to see. Okay, what is a politician in South Africa or in Mexico or somewhere in the global South that's viewing these conflicts from a completely different point of view? I mean, shouldn't the people of the United States also hear that too, so that they're not just have this warped sense of the world that only comes from the Democrats and Republicans? It's like people have such distrust for Congress. They have such distrust for the main political parties. They distrust the president. And yet when it comes to the media, even though they distrust the media, they still end up imbibing a lot of what those same forces that they distrust say. So independent media, I think, is growing because of the distrust of establishment media, but it needs to be much, much bigger. We're still very small compared to the power that the corporate-owned media has. And of course, even our little successes are met with censorship, either silent shadow censorship or direct censorship. The last few months, we've seen so many channels being taken down, so many Twitter pages no longer able to reach their followers. You know, it's really demonstrated how even this new era of social media, even though it was supposed to offer so much democratization of information and so forth, it's actually become, in a way, its own prison, a new prison. And all the control that they used to hold over television, they're now trying to recapture in social media. And those voices that they can't totally squelch, they're going to try to censor, or they're going to try to shadow ban. And so I think it's really important that anyone who's following independent media, don't just watch it. You have to promote it. You have to share it. You have to tell your friends. You have to tell your neighbors, your family members. Really try to get them hooked into something other than their current media appetite, because we're really fighting for people's hearts and minds, I would say. And we have to do it at a larger scale if we're going to be effective. It's not just about being the few people who's like in the know. We really have a responsibility, if you're in the know, to get other people to watch as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ben Becker, Editor-in-Chief, Breakthrough News, first-time caller, long-time listener. Very happy to have you here on the Freedom Side. We'll be looking forward to having you back.